Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Preparing Poetry for Submission for the Mairtín Crawford Award 2026. I'm Kathleen McCracken, and it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow poet, Don Watson. I'm just going to begin by saying a few words about how the workshop will be structured, what we're going to cover. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the background to the award so that you know who Mairtín Crawford was and why the award is in his name. Don will then say a little bit about the practicalities and how you might go about submitting most effectively to the award. And then together we're going to discuss some key areas such as eligibility, the submission criteria, judging process, what we're looking for as judges, give you some advice on how to submit and go over some of the common errors that occur in submission. You're invited to write questions into the chat, and we'll address these in the last 20 minutes or so of the session. Okay, so please feel free to do that as things come to mind. So Dawn, I'll let you introduce yourself and I'll come back and say a few words about myself.
Thanks, Kathleen. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming along. Yeah, my name is Dawn Watson, and I'm the author of We Play Here, which was published by Grant the Poetry. I'm a poetry pamphlet, The Stack of Owls is Getting Higher, is published by the Emma Press. I'm a former journalist and sub-editor for about 20 years in the News of the World, the Sunday Times, and I sort of changed career and I completed a PhD in poetry at the Heaney Centre in 2022. And now I'm a lecturer in creative writing at Queen's University, where I live in Belfast, and I teach on the MA pathway in both poetry and prose.
Hey, thanks, Dawn. As I've said, I'm Kathleen McCracken. I have published 8 collections of poetry, most recently a new and selected called Double Self-Portrait with Mair, and that's actually a bilingual edition, which was co-published with a Brazilian Portuguese publisher. I suppose most recently I was involved in a poetry, photography, film collaboration with filmmaker John T. Davis. We had an exhibition. Gosh, it's nearly 2 years ago now that that's happened. It seems like yesterday in the Ulster University Gallery, and that was there's a film poem, a bunch of photographs, and one of my long poems, which were all involved in that exhibition, which was called The Ballad of Gideon Light. What else about me? I'm currently working on 2 new collections. Part of one of those is on the Abridged website if you wanted to go and have a look at that. It's called A Sound Gunman. I was over 30 years teaching at Ulster University, creative writing, contemporary literature, and now retired, but enjoying mentoring, doing a lot more of my own writing and editing on the editorial board of the newly established McCracken Press. So that's me. Okay, Dawn, I'll let you say, oh no, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the award. That's right. The Mairtín Crawford Award, this is our 3rd year, I think, of judging for it. And it's been a real pleasure to do that, just to be introduced to the new work that's coming out from a range of poets across the island and further afield. The award was inaugurated in 2017 by the poet Moira Donaldson as an award for new and emerging poets working towards a first full collection. It was initially just for poetry, and then a year later, the Short Story Award was added to that in 2018. And I think Moira, she inaugurated this award as a way of honoring her good friend and fellow poet, Mairtín Crawford. Mairtín died suddenly in 2004, and Moira and others wanted to acknowledge the importance of his encouragement of and influence on poets and poetry in Northern Ireland. Mairtín was born in Belfast, grew up, went educated at Queen's, and he was kind of, I think, at the center of a poetry collective called Gyros, which now seems like, poetry history in Belfast terms, but it was still very much alive when I first came to Belfast. There he was the editor of a radical poetry journal called The Big Spoon. And he also worked as an editor at Fortnight magazine, which you will be familiar with. He became connected with the Crescent Arts Centre through facilitating creative writing workshops there at the centre, and was later appointed writer in residence, became, I think, the first director of the Between the Lines Festival, which was the precursor to the Belfast Book Festival, which this is very much part of. Mairtín was determined, I think, to ensure the representation of a wide variety of voices, diverse and particularly marginalized voices. So he was promoting access to poetry through creative writing workshops through the broader community. Um, I remember him from, I think it was 1993 that he brought Allen Ginsberg to the Crescent Arts, and that was a really big event. We all traipsed along to hear Allen. Wonderful night. So that's the kind of person he was, making things happen. And the prize, the award, is very much part of his legacy. In 2005, Lagan Press published his selected poems, and I understand there is work underway or plans in place to republish the selected with a foreword about the awards and the Belfast Book Festival. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context or background for why we have this award and the importance of it within the literary community in Belfast and on the island of Ireland. Okay. So Dawn, do you want to say a little bit about the practicalities, and then we'll leap into
Yeah,
philosophical stuff?
yeah, absolutely. I'll go through some of this, some of these practical parts of applying and whatnot. This is all on the website as well, so yeah, you can double check it there. So the submission window, it opened on the start of December there, 2025, and it closes at 12 noon on Wednesday, March the 11th. So what's that? Sort of another month and a couple of weeks, by 6 weeks. The shortlist then, it will be announced on May the 18th. And the shortlisted poets are contacted privately through email, sort of just prior to a public announcement. Winners, runners up, and all the placed entrants. Those are announced on Thursday, the 4th of June at the Mairtín Crawford Award event, which happens every year at the Belfast Book Festival, which is running between the 5th and the 12th of June. So the winner will get £500 cash prize and a time to write package, which includes a 3 night stay at a hotel in Belfast and 4 days of dedicated writing space at the Crescent Arts, which would just be great. The two runners up then they each receive £250 cash prize as well. So yes, myself and Kathleen are the judges this year. Yeah, it is our third year. So yeah, it's exciting. The poet Milena Williamson, she helps in this process too. So she reads all the submissions and she creates the long list that we then choose a short list from. So all the submissions are read anonymously. You'll all have numbers rather than names on the pages. And yeah, so myself and Kathleen, we will then read the long list of 20 and we choose a short list of 6 from that. Yeah, and that's it. And I suppose, yeah, you can't also correspond on a one-to-one with the entrants as well. That's just sort of we were just given the printouts and we then take them away and read them. So eligibility wise, the key aim is to support emerging writers at the beginning of their career who are working towards a full collection and haven't done that yet. The entrant can have you can have been previously published in print or online, or have been broadcast or have won a prize. That's fine. And you can have published a pamphlet, which is a short chapbook of poetry, or a self-published collection is also okay. The only thing that it excludes really is people who have published a first full collection, and beyond. So open to those who are born in, are citizens or residents of Ireland and the UK and are over 18 years of age. Submission criteria, you can submit a maximum of 5 poems and a minimum of 3. And let me see. I don't want to read all of this out because most of it is online. The entry fee is £10 this year. Previously, yeah, if a fee is a barrier, then if it is a barrier to applying, the cost of you can contact the Crescent Arts and you can get a free entry place. So that's also available, and that email address is on their site. Each individual poem must be no longer than 60 lines. That doesn't include the title or the spaces in between the stanzas. Um, so like a sort of standard length maybe might be in a competition is usually around 40 lines. So this is longer than that. So if your poem is more than 1 page in length, make sure the pages it covers are numbered at the bottom. All pages must include a header with the title of the poem only. And if it's untitled, title it with the opening 5 words of your poem. Again, all of this is online. Um, yeah, let's see, anything else? Yep, no, I think that's really it. I mean that in terms of like how you would lay it out, if you stick to a Times New Roman font, that's the kind of industry standard, single spaced for poetry and 12-point size. Or really, I mean, any clear to read font will generally be fine as well. Just no sort of Comic Sans or crazy sort of colors or anything like that. Um, the visual impact of it is important, I think, with your poems, how they sit on a page and how they look. So don't include pictures or photos or anything like that. Just the words. It's important. I mean, it's a great prize. This I entered it. I think it must have been, oh God, more than 10 years ago now, probably. And I was shortlisted, and it was the first thing I'd ever entered as a poet. And so it's more than just winning or getting shortlisted. There's something about entering your poems into a competition that I think you sort of show yourself that you're taking yourself seriously, as a writer and a poet, and it can be hard to do that. I think we all struggle to feel like whether we're good enough. I don't know if that ever really goes away, but it's a good thing to enter and to just go for, regardless of the outcome. And it's quite a unique award too that you can enter 3 to 5 poems. Normally, I think competitions are just one poem, so it's that kind of experience of curating, a mini collection almost of poems. And another note on that is that they don't all need to connect thematically or sort of, have any real connection to each other. They can be completely different poems about completely different things as well. But it is your opportunity to put together work that sits and sort of seems like, you know, this is your work, and have a sense to how those sit alongside one another as poems. It's just a good opportunity to do that. Um, so I think what we're going to do, Kathleen and I, we've got some questions that we're going to ask each other, I think, right? And you guys are free to put questions in the chat. And in fact, that would be amazing if you did. And we would rather answer your questions than our own. But in the meantime, we'll have a chat ourselves, Kathleen. Yes.
Yep, for sure. Okay.
I think we're
We
sort of
maybe
like,
start with this question of what I think people wonder what we're looking for, as judges. What is it that you're after? What can I do that's going to attract your attention and make you choose me?
yeah,
Um,
I know it is a good question. I mean, there's no, I mean, like I was saying, there's no obvious sort of thing that you need to write about. There's no themes that are, I guess, excluded as such. I think when it comes to me, like how do we know a good poem when we see it, or what makes a good poem? I was thinking about this, and there's, I think the 3 words that came to mind were music, imagery, and mystery. There's something about a poem that says something in a way that is surprising, and it shows you something in a way that it just alludes to something that it's hard to describe in words. I mean, this is why we turn to poems, I think, why we write poems to begin with. It can be hard to say something in plain speak, but almost saying it in a poem is the clearer way sometimes to say it. Um, and yeah, I think that can feel a bit mysterious. I think that can feel strange, but yeah, you know what I mean? Sometimes it's just something, a poem that is kind of, it says something in a way that is just unusual, and but it makes you somehow see it clearer, I think.
yeah, it can be something very ordinary. I mean, I often read poems about, a tree, a bird, and I see
Yeah,
them every day, but this poet has maybe see it differently, maybe see it from a different angle. And that I think always gets a check mark from me
Yeah.
from any poet. So it's just maybe thinking, bringing that new perspective, that surprise to what you're saying about the subject that really begins to turn me on about a poem.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it's always about language for me. And as you say, music, there's the mystery and then there's the music.
Yeah.
As was poetry is different from prose in that way that it's much more tuned to the musical elements. How do the words sound? I mean, it was just listen, I recommend this to anybody that has time. A little radio program which Radio 4 did a couple of weeks ago about the poems on the underground in London and the history of that. And one of the poets was saying, what was his name? Underwood. Is it Jack Underwood?
Yeah.
John
Yeah,
Underwood?
Jack.
Yeah. And he said, some of these words here, phrases, I'm not really sure what they mean, but the sound of them, they came to me and I put them in, and somehow that works. So sometimes I think if you're led by the sound of the words and the musicality of the phrase from some unconscious source, that gives you something that's just meant to be there. So I think we'd be looking for that too, and that's all
Yeah.
about opening those channels and having the antennae kind of twinkling there and listening in for those sort of musical sounds that somehow make sense and hook into this idea of surprise and bringing us something mysterious and new. So if that's not all too abstract, that's a couple of things we might be looking for. Um,
I think somehow saying all of that, but also the trick is somehow saying that in your own voice, saying that in an honest, simple, plain way. I think sometimes there's that temptation, at least when you're sort of starting in your poetry career, to kind of reach for like archaic kind of poetic speak, and things sound a little bit Jane Eyre or something. But I think it's just sort of saying it in such a simple way in your own accent, your own sort of vernacular. That really I think is what kind of there's something about the combination of that, speaking to something like we were saying with the kind of the strangeness and the unusual, but said in a very simple way, can be very, very striking. Um, and I suppose like again, I think you always want, don't you, in a poem, when you get to the end of it, you want to feel a sense of impact or some in some way. You want either the air to be slightly sucked out of the room or a little bit of a punch to the gut. You're almost sort of working towards a slight reveal in some way. Maybe where things come together at the very end. And it's quite hard to put that into words, what that is. It's the sort of uplift or the uplift moment.
it has to do with voice, I guess, really how that
Yeah,
poet is conveying whatever uniqueness or they've discovered. But,
yeah,
Heaney has that essay about voice and how do you discover your own voice. And I think at this stage of a poet's career, emerging poets, we're looking for at least glimmers of a voice that is distinctive.
yeah,
And that comes through everything we're talking about, the use of imagery, the kind of language you choose, the way that you reveal that subject. That's, I think, one of the if we can see that across those 5 or 3 or 4 poems, there's a kind of consistent voice that's different, that has its own imprint, then
mhm.
we're more likely maybe to set that one aside and say, yeah, that's going in the long list or the
Yeah.
shortest path. And again, it's very hard to say what that is because it's different for everybody, is it not? The voice.
It
It's
really is. Yeah. It is. It's. I think that's why it's important to not to reach for cliches or sort of well-worn language and tropes and sort of things that are over
that we've heard
familiar.
before, that are familiar, that we've heard before. I mean, I often write that back on manuscripts. It's just, I've heard this before. Say it to me in a way that, with
Yeah.
a word that I haven't heard used before in this context.
Yeah.
Um, it's all part of development. Something too, I notice what we're looking for. I mean, poetry isn't prose, and I think sometimes the tendency is to think, oh, well, my reader won't get it unless I say, and then, and next, and over there. poetry, Robert Bly talked about leaping poetry, and I think it's a bit like cinema, isn't it? That you let your reader make the connections
Yeah.
between the image and the next. It's the old show, don't tell, you
Yeah.
know.
That's
Um,
true. That's right. I
and
think,
when
sorry, no, go
I
ahead.
see a poem that's brave enough to do that, to, let the reader make the connections. I like that. I'll respond to that. I'll be partly because I'm engaged with it. I like to be involved in the meaning making process here.
Oh my God, yes, absolutely.
You
That is
know,
so important.
yeah,
I think I think there are, aren't there, there's sort of psychological writings have been done on this, that the best writing, whether that's prose or poetry, is one that engages you to figure it out. You know, if you're being told what to think, you know, like this is a sad moment here, you know, like you're kind of, it's a bit boring. But if you're sort of showing that, you know, in some way, if you're suggesting that through image, then the reader is invited into the meaning making process.
yeah. I think a reader's more likely to feel or experience a poem then, rather
Yeah.
than sit back and watch it happen in front of them. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
And just what you were saying about the one thing after another, you know, there's that term, isn't there, parataxis, you know, in within poetry, where instead of putting connective words such as therefore or because or and, trying to sort of take those out. And actually, whenever you just place image after image, you know, like the cat is black, the moon is red, the tree fell over, and you sort of put these things one after another. What we do in our brain is we automatically sort of connect them into this. These must be linked, you know, these are all in the same moment. And I think that's where you can't really get away with that in prose so much, but in a poem, because you're creating this compressed sort of event in a way, you know, you can. And
yeah, it's much like the analogy of a cinema.
yeah.
We're very cinema literate now, and we're used to jumping for, jump cuts and cross.
Yes.
They don't really explain things, Suddenly you're in one setting and then you're in the next. But we can figure that out, and so give your reader credit and allow them to make those sort of leaps and connections. They'll be much more satisfied, I think, than if
Yeah.
you're spelling it all out for them. So those are just some of the things we look for. I
Hmm.
suppose the last thing might be much more practical, like editorial accuracy, presentational impact. How does the poem look? How
Yeah.
careful have you been as an editor?
Yeah.
Because those things can really if you haven't got them right, can really capsize a poem.
Yeah.
Um, and it's the difference between it going in the long list or short list pile and not going in the long list or short list pile, because it could be really good in all kinds of other ways, but you've got typos and spelling mistakes and editorial inaccuracies, punctuation is up the left, whatever it is, that can make the difference between a strong poem and a weak poem. So
Yeah.
bear that very practical thing in mind, as well as these other structural and ideational.
It is. It is important. There's something about the poem that it's a very web-like structure. You know, it's very delicate in some ways. And I think whenever there's sort of spelling errors or anything like that within it, it just kind of spoils that illusion, strangely. Or so yeah, just a simple check of that kind of thing, and that there's no run-on errors or yeah, just that everything's sort of single line spaced, and it's quite sort of simple. It's letting the words do the talking. Um, yeah.
Who were maybe looking at form. For poetic form is so broad now. It used to be understood you had what, four-line stanzas and they all rhymed or whatever, but feel
Yes.
free to experiment with form. You might first or second draft, you might have everything in a prose form, or you might have everything aligned with the left margin, but play with that and see what you can do visually on the page that
Mhm.
is interesting or different, or that not just for the sake of it on the surface, but that actually the form is somehow connecting to or reflecting or saying something more about the content.
Mhm.
I see a lot more people using italics, not necessarily for speech, but just to give a slightly different tone or emphasis, or
Mhm.
placing that line or phrase at a different position on the page. Sometimes all the whole poem will be aligned with the right margin instead of the left. Just think about things like that that might bring something more about meaning as well as visual interests to your poem. It's nice to find that. I think last year, Don, if I'm right, we had a couple of pieces that were like prose poems,
Yes,
and they
quite
were
a lot.
short. Yeah, and those were interesting. They added variation. You could have one or two of those within your 5 poem or 3 or 4 poem collection.
Yeah,
So to show your range. Yeah.
I think so. That's it. And also just that don't feel that you also have to sort of show various forms, in order to kind of be more likely to be in with a chance or anything like that. You can submit 5 prose poems. It's really about, I mean, it's about the voice, and it's about how the thing is working as a poem. But certainly yes. I mean, if you have got range and you've got that ability, then absolutely go for it.
Mhm. Okay, a note here about common errors. I mean, we've said a little bit about that already,
Hmm.
in terms of formatting or presentation not being accurate or correct. I think something I always bear in mind is this abstract versus concrete. What I mean by that is give us an image, just tell us, describe an object rather than tell us how, what would be an example of that. The ship sailed up the river as opposed to I felt my emotions pulling me towards something. Give
Yeah.
us an image that represents that feeling, and it will always be more effective, I think. So concrete over abstract, and beginning poets very often do that. I think it is that legacy of an older type of poetry where abstraction was maybe more in vogue, or understood to be more effective than the concrete. Once we get into the 20th century, the images and all that, imagery really it changes,
Yeah.
and there's a lot
It
more focus.
does.
Go ahead.
It does. I think image as well. It's just that it's that's the point of it. It's like the image is to say something more clearly than even if you were to say, I've had a really hard day. Is there an image that would show that, rather than saying that? And it's so much more specific and unique. And we're just striving to say things in a way that, just so ordinary prose, ordinary rhetoric doesn't quite sort of hit it. Um, just I've noticed Catherine had asked in that process, are you long listing a poet or single poem from their collection, from their submission? It's the poet, so it's the collection overall. So it's your 3 to 5 poems. So there's not isn't that right? Or am I completely misremembering? But it's all it's the whole it's the poet's submission. Uh,
Yeah, I think it's the overall. We
yeah.
wouldn't, if there was one really strong poem and 4 that weren't, I think we
Yeah,
have to say no.
it
What
gives you a
we're,
problem. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, we're kind of judging collections almost here because there is a curation, and a part of, not entirely, but a part of what we're looking for is that ability to either show off the diversity of your ability, across the 3 to 5 poems, or the unity of your ability across something that connects all the poems, or something that shows us the diversity. But we're pretty much looking for those that have equal strength across all the poems that you submit, whether it's 3 or 5, if that makes sense.
yeah,
So
yeah. And just yeah, further to that, some of them can have been published. You can have had poems and appear in a magazine or a journal. It's just the only rule is that you haven't had a full collection published. That's the only rule.
yeah, at
Um,
least the rules say that at least one of the poems has to be unpublished.
okay,
Yeah, so if you're submitting 5, 4 of them could have appeared in journals or elsewhere.
right.
One of them needs to be absolutely new. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And yeah,
Uh,
feel free to ask questions in general about anything that isn't literally to do with this kind of nitty-gritty stuff too. You can ask us I mean, while we're here, anything to do with our own writing and ourselves as well, if anything pops into your head. Um, but yeah, carrying on from that common errors, I think one of the things that I think that you'd said before, Kathleen, was saving a Word document as a PDF sometimes can sort of help you like almost see it differently. It's because it looks different on the page suddenly in a strange way, doesn't it?
yeah, people might not know what a PDF is versus a Word, if you're using Word as your major, whether you're PC or Mac, Word is
Oh yeah.
using or Pages. PDF is, you can choose it as a format in which to save your document. And it does a couple of things, just what you're saying, Don. It makes it look more professional. It looks like a published page in a book. So that can give a different inflection to how you read the poem or feel about it visually. But in terms of submission, I think we always kind of recommend, if you can, to submit it as a PDF, because that locks everything in place. Whereas with Word, when you upload it or email it, the lines and the words can shift around on the page. And so you might think you've submitted it looking this way, but it's actually received looking differently, and that can upset or undermine or even destroy what you want to convey with the poem. So we
Yeah.
do recommend you submit it as a PDF. We're still, as you say, Don, 6 weeks before the submission date. So if you don't know how to do that, just get a little bit of help. It's a fairly simple way of saving a document. Okay. Yeah. Other things about airs, I mean, do read the rules of the competition. We're mentioning quite a few of these, but they're all there on the website. So do follow those religiously. Having your name on the page and choosing the appropriate font, that sort of thing. Again, it can be the difference between getting on a long list and not if you haven't followed the rules accurately. So
Like just page numbers, those sort of simple things that whenever we drop the printouts, inevitably, we can we can see the order to put them back in.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Grace is in the chat there asking, hello, thank you for your time. I'm wondering how long usually is your process when writing poems from idea to final edit?
Just looking at that. How long? Our own process.
Yep.
Gosh,
God.
it varies, doesn't it, really?
Yeah.
Once in a while, you get really lucky, and the first draft is almost the whole thing. It's like a gift from the gods when that happens. But usually, I don't know. I mean, I do save drafts mostly on paper. It could be days, it could be weeks, it could be even months, when you go put a poem away and come back to it. It really does vary.
I know sometimes it's years, there's a poem that you go back to. I, I, I was talking about this recently with Tara Bergen. It was for this interview I did for Poetry London, and we were like, we're both sort of had the same experience, which is that you get, unless you sort of figure out your voice somehow or what the speaker's voice in the poem is, it's quite hard then. I think from the outset then you're sort of trying to create something without a clear sense of almost who's speaking, and that what can happen for me is that I tend to compress it and compress it, and then I go back to it and I try to like tighten it and tighten it, and then I sort of squeeze the air out of it, and I find that I end up with something that I just need to start again. And that can be hard too. And I think a single poem can be so frustrating sometimes. But but yeah, like you say, Kathleen, occasionally one comes along. I think I've had one or two like that in my life where it's just fully formed on the page, but mostly it isn't. And it is just allowing yourself time to go back and go back. And I think I had a poem to write for the Lynn Hall Library. Actually, I was commissioned to write a poem this is due at the end of this month, which is in a week's time. And I actually wrote it way back in September, I think. And then I came back to it in December and was like, oh my God, this is the worst thing I've ever read in my life. And I changed it. And I just read it again there yesterday. And again, I'm like, oh my God Almighty, this is what was I thinking? And I'm sad. And now I've got 4 different versions in the Word document. And it's like there's something that happens at that point where you're just like, what is it I was trying to say? What am I trying to say? And that might have even changed from when you started the poem, So a poem sometimes feels like a live document that every time
Mm.
you go into it, you're bringing a different self into it, on a different day almost. And so I guess the question is like almost like, how do you know when a poem's finished? That probably leads us into all these big, big questions, but
I think, a lot of poets or writers generally would say it's never really finished. And I know from, studying other poets that if you look at the original collection that was published in, 2007, and then they do a new and selected, and then they do a collected, if you trace a single poem across those editions, you'll see that there have been changes.
Yeah.
And so in that way, even a published poem is not a final document for a lot of poets. There would be other poets that would say, along with Ginsberg, I mentioned him
Yeah.
again, first thought, best thought. Now he claimed that what he put down was, that was it. It spilled out and you didn't change anything, which was of course a lie, because when we look back at his papers, we see just how much editorial work was done
Yeah.
on even, a major poem like Howl. But I think it just does vary.
Hmm.
What you're mentioning about a commission or having a deadline, I
Yeah.
think this can be very useful. And this competition is a deadline for those of you that are submitting to it. That if it does make you stop, and it does make you work on it more intensely when you know by a certain date I have to have this done.
Yeah.
So sometimes that pressure will force you towards finding that final form. But again, like you say, Dawn, it is a live thing, and
Yeah.
it's like us as humans or cats as people. They're always changing. We're shedding, we're acquiring. So I think
Yeah.
there's no definite answer, in other words, to how long it takes.
There's not, I think it's important too. I mean, it's good and it's a blessing if you have it, but someone who can read your poems for you, and sort of give you a wee bit of feedback, like another poet, ideally. Um, I know if I were to give it to somebody who wasn't a poet, they'd be like, aye, that sounds great. Yep. But there's another poet can really engage with you about it. And I know when I wrote the book, when I wrote We Play Here, I remember I submitted that, and then my editor there, Rachel Allen at Granta, she got back to me. And there were certain sections in that where she was like, you know what, I just feel like you could push the language here more. I feel like you could, you know, and sometimes just someone telling you that, you're like, yeah, of course I can. I can immediately see it. And you can sort of see where you could have pushed it more. So, I mean, I find that quite disturbing in a way, that it's like that I'm thinking that's fine. But as soon as somebody outside of that, out of my brain says, could you say more about that? Then suddenly I have a whole other room of things I could say about it, but I find it hard to access that without a push sometimes. So I guess I don't know what we're saying really. It's like you're probably right that it's never finished. There's no right answer. There's no sort of, and it's somehow learning that lesson. I moved house recently and I'm putting pictures up around the house at the minute, and I keep going back and forth and going, is this the right place for this picture? And I'm like, I'm putting it up and I'm like, I don't know, because it's a lot of pressure. You're like, this is where it's going to sit for the next 20 years. But it's just sort of understanding that actually it's there's no right answer. Yeah, and lots of things would look right and lots of things, would look right another place as well. So it's the same with words, I think, and it's the same with poems.
Yeah, yeah, no, I totally agree about having another person or persons, and that's why workshops can be so valuable,
Yeah.
where you share your work not just with one person, but with a group of people. Over the years, I mean, and others will see things in a poem that you just did not think was there at all. And that can be really revelatory too. And you think, oh, I thought I wrote a poem about this, that, or the other, and they see something completely different, which can send you off in another direction, write another poem. But it really, I think it's very important to have that feedback. And it's also gratifying if another poet or friend or reader can say, yeah, that really works. That moves me. I was crying, or that made me smile, whatever. That kind of reinforcement can be just as positive as the harsher, feedback that says, right, you really should change this or that.
Yeah.
Having somebody else there is important. Right. Is there anything else there in the chat while we're paused for a moment? Nope.
No, don't think so.
We had another question here about, and we've maybe covered this a little bit, whether there are specific themes that submissions should all be around this theme. I think we have answered that, if you're working on a group, you submit the ones that sit well together, or you can aim to show different styles. And sometimes in those submissions, you wouldn't even know it was the same poet writing each of the 5 poems, because they're so stylistically different. And
Yeah.
that's just as interesting, and it can be just as strong as having 5 poems set around a theme of whatever it is.
Yeah. I think
And likewise, in terms of the form, they don't all have to be longish poems. They don't all have to be within the 60 lines. They don't all have to be short, variety.
I think and it's the same as I think when you're putting together a chapbook of poems, or when you're putting together even a full collection, what you'll be thinking about is what's the poem at the start of the collection and what's the poem that I'm finishing on, and in a sense an arc, and not to think about this too much because there's no hard and fast rule as to what that should be, but I think like when you're putting together an album, sometimes the first song on the album is like a real short sort of like banger, and it's kind of gets you into it, and then there's a kind of a long. I think there's an art to this, isn't there? Like, I mean, I think about Nirvana or something, and like there's a really hard, fast, short, and then it goes into like a longer sort of ballady thing, and then there's a kind of, and it sort of breaks there's a rhythm. Just thinking about that, maybe not starting with a really, really long one. Maybe you start with something shorter, and um, yeah, it's interesting. There's no right or wrong, I think.
Yeah, it's when you're putting together a collection, I
Yeah,
listen, I always sort of recommend it to other people to lay them out on the floor and play around with them, play checkers with them and see
yeah,
what there can be various journeys through a collection or through a shorter pamphlet type, or even the five poems that you're talking about here. Just play around with them, even read them through. If you do have five, let's say, lay them out on the floor. How do they look? Read through them aloud, record it, whatever, and see what's the shape involved in the different configurations that you might come up with. And
yeah,
that can be quite revealing to your own practice, never mind for this
yeah,
submission. But
yeah,
that kind of thing can give you a sense of how they look as well as how they sound and again, the meaning or the sense of them is doing in
yeah.
relation to one another. But the analogy with the album is a good one because
Mhm.
we're all used to, or we used to be, I don't know so much
It used
now,
to be, yeah.
the Spotify thing and all, you choose one track after another. But when you look at a crafted collection of that sort, there is intent there, I think, and developing that again antennae for intent is important. So
Yeah. I think sometimes too you can kind of not see it. You cannot see how your poems connect. And it's important then to sort of be aware that even just if you're writing poems in the same particular time of your life, there might be more of a sense of loss to the language, for example, or isolation, than you realize, and I think maybe sort of not overthinking that there's obvious themes that have to, that maybe, there's the voice that they're written in sort of speaks to connection
mhm.
between them, too.
Yeah, and then that kind of comes and goes like tides, and I think at a certain point that
Yeah,
particular focus or voice dissipates and you're on to something else. But right
yeah,
now, for the purposes of this, it's likely, unless you're drawing on material you've had for a long time in the drawer and reworking some of that, it's likely that you are in a moment where there is a sort of unity there that
yeah,
once you start reading them back to yourself or looking at them in terms of how
yeah.
they relate to each other, you'll discover that is there. Um, that,
Notice another poem or sorry, another question in the chat from Dervla there, which was, given the global news at the moment, a lot of my work is responses to politics. Would you dissuade from including political poems for this award, or if they are strong poems, is that okay?
it's absolutely okay. Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of poets are, I think, commenting or addressing, grappling with political situations of all stripes in different ways. And it's great to find that, in a poem. It doesn't have to be there, but we would welcome it, I think, as a topic.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's like what is political, our bodies, love, so much is political. I suppose if you're talking specifically about maybe the global moment and Trump and all that kind of stuff too, like you can write about absolutely anything. I think the trap just to beware of what maybe with political poems is that you could be is not being didactic or sort of telling someone what to think, I think in a poem, and I think that can sort of turn off a reader if you feel like you're being told what to think. I think like maybe the intention behind a poem is to kind of is it as poets? Is it to hold up a sort of a thought, a consideration, something to think into, um, rather than sort of providing the answer? Maybe it sort of invites you to think about what the answer is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can be really angry or really passionate
Absolutely.
without soapboxing about it,
Yeah.
without using the poem as a platform for simply, as you say, Don, telling others what to think. you can get your position across in more subtle ways, which goes back to this idea of the mystery in the poem, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
that somehow the political message is not conveyed so boldly that we feel
Yeah.
like we're being sledgehammered with a point of view, but
Yes.
just as you say, that it provokes thought and provokes a way of thinking about an issue in a different way than maybe we have before.
Yeah.
It can be persuasive, very persuasive, and mind changing, but without being exclusively overt about it. Yeah. Yeah.
I think so.
But
Yeah.
the answer to that is yes. I think we're in a way always writing political poems
I
in
mean, we
that,
are. Yeah.
the personal is political, and power politics and all those phrases that have become almost cliches in themselves remain true.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking about how we treat our pet friends, or how we interact with our own bodies, as you say, or how we feel about global situations. It is in some ways all about politics.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, think of books like Claudia Rankine's book, Citizen, or where you're looking at someone who's very explicitly kind of laying out the experience of a black person in contemporary America, and it's very much poetry has always been used in that way. It's been used to speak into unfairness and inequality, and yeah, like you say, Kathleen, the personal is political, and what's personal to each of us is different. But yeah, it's probably just avoiding that sort of like do this, think this message.
Yeah, again, it's about how you use language.
Mm.
Very often it's not what you say, but how you say it
Yeah.
that has the impact or the effect that you want to achieve. So
Mhm.
I think
Yes.
you do turn people off almost instantly if you're just grandstanding and kind of exploiting the poetic form
Yes.
to get a very specific point of view across. Whereas if you're a little bit more subtle about it, you can persuade people more
Yeah.
effectively, more deeply. So good.
I mean, people talk about poets as the canaries in the mines, don't they, in some ways, that you're sort of like you have your antenna up and you're
Yeah.
for what's coming. And yeah.
Yeah. When you say that, I mean, it makes me think of Margaret Atwood, who repeatedly says in her interviews, I just looked at what's happened historically or what's happening now, and I write that, and then
Yeah.
I'm sort of seen as this oracle or witch in a
Yeah.
positive sense that can foresee the future. But really, she's just looking at what's going on or what has happened and the way that history is likely to move in cycles. And if you think of things that way when you're writing, you can sometimes connect our moment with other moments, and then you're actually saying something about where we're going now. So,
Yes.
yeah.
I think that's it. It's impossible, isn't it, to write a poem in January 2026 and not have it informed by everything that's going on around us. Every single day, we're really just we're in a fish tank of it, aren't we? We're just sort of surrounded by it. And I mean, you mentioned the T.S. Eliot winner, Kathleen, earlier. What was it, Karen?
Erin Solé is her name.
Yeah. And she's written quite a sort of environmental book, wasn't it? You were saying, sort of set in
Uh,
Canada.
yeah, the book that won the award this year is called Well Water, and the title poem is, well, to really put it very basely, I suppose it's about how once upon a time you could drink the water out of wells on the prairie. She's from Saskatchewan. But hers is a poetry that is subtly and sometimes not so subtly informed by how monoculture is destroying, or monoagriculture is destroying really pristine hinterland in Canada and
Yeah.
elsewhere too, but very environmentally aware, politically aware. And yet there's a personal strain through all that work that grounds it and allows us to connect with the first person in the poems. Yeah, it was just recommending it to you, Don, before we came on air. So
Yes.
but it did win that award and is a good example for anybody, I think, of a poetry that is highly political and yet very subtle in the way it gets that politics across
Mhm.
to the reader. Yeah, you're moved and educated, and all kinds of hijinks with language and imagery going on as well. So I guess, she really achieved that combination of the things that we say we're looking for here in quality poetry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay, maybe move on from that. How do you get started writing a poem? Where do you get inspiration from? That's a question that is often asked, in workshops or individually. How would you respond to that?
I saw someone one time talk about it as I can't remember who it was or what, or maybe I've dreamt this, but it was, the film The Evil Dead in the 80s that, I don't know if you've ever watched it, but there's a kind of a technique they use where the camera is set at a distance and then it sort of pans really, really quickly, quite towards you and sort of right up close. And sometimes it feels like poems are like that, like they just kind of zoom at you out of nowhere and they're in your head and something hits you, a feeling. But I think rarely is that my experience. I think sometimes I just get the feeling like you're always thinking about poems. You're constantly there's that sort of isn't there that meme, I think, where poets are always just saying something's like something else. It was like this, I was like, it was like, and I do think that's true. I think you're constantly sort of thinking of things that remind you of other things and sort of making connections between things. And for me, it's I kind of trying to sort of create a practice of paying attention and noticing and just sitting and being and how do I do that or how do I make sure I'm doing that in my day, whether that's through going for a run or taking 15 minutes in the morning to light a candle, whatever it is. But I think trying to sort of curate a sort of a mentality of noticing and writing those things down that don't necessarily be poems straight away, but maybe become them.
Yeah, that's a lot of things there you've mentioned. I mean, the notebook
So,
or or keeping notes on your phone, as a lot of people do now, because those things thinking of Virginia Woolf talking about her fish, the minute you think something, it swims away again.
yeah.
So it's always good to keep a little notebook or some record of those moments or words or phrases. Um, Sometimes things do just come at you at that velocity that you're describing it in, but again, it's rare. I think uh, for me, it kind of often starts with a sound or a word or a phrase. That sort of, I listen to the radio a lot. I'm getting old, so I'm like a radio fanatic, and I don't pay too much attention to social media, I guess. But there'll just be a word like or a phrase that I would hear somebody use on air, and I think, oh right, yeah, and that triggers something. Likewise with reading or listen to conversations, picking up that voice that then I might transmute
Yeah.
into my own voice in some way. That can be and has been often the start of a poem.
Yeah.
Like you say, just paying attention. There's
I think
Canadian writer Timothy Finlay says, over and over in that book of his, The Wars, fantastic novel, he says, pay attention, remember this.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, and just like on your walk or your run or whatever you're doing in the kitchen, it's about really paying attention to the immediate, almost meditating
Mhm.
on the immediate as you're doing it, something can emerge out of that so quickly. So it's just again the antennae thing, isn't it? Being
Mhm. Mhm.
the wee snail with his antennae, and he's touching there. She is touching things as she goes along and picking up information and
Yeah.
ideas. So
I
that's
do. I think poems know things, and I think in ways that we don't consciously know them. And I think our poet brains know things as well, And I remember I was in a car and I was driving in Texas and the radio was on and there was a story on the radio about a killer whale, and it had a mother, an orca, and she had lost her baby had died when she gave birth, and so she spent weeks around the coast, 14 miles off the coast of Canada, just pushing the baby around in the sea uh, and just nosing it ahead of her and I couldn't forget this image. It was so haunting to me and I really just didn't know what to do with it, but I just knew that I couldn't stop thinking about it, and eventually that ended up in a poem about a relationship breaking up, and I think it's sort of, for me, on some level, that image knew something that I didn't, yeah, so I don't know how we do that, where we sort of create space to just kind of hear and know and pay attention to, but not necessarily feel like we need to jam it into a poem straight away because sometimes it takes time.
we can almost absorb that subconsciously, you might say. And it's almost like it's waiting there for the right moment to be written
Yeah.
in correlation to lived experience.
Yeah.
So again, that's why it's important to pay attention, turn
Yeah.
the radio on, listen to the story, whatever it is that that kind of clicks that or unlocks
Yeah.
the words at the right moment. Maybe a little bit more prosaically for me, very often looking at other art. I suppose listening to radio is like that too, but there's a lot of ekphrasis out there that is poems after paintings, but it does films, poems, visual art, sculptures, music. The other arts, the sister and brother arts, I think are very rich sources for poets. Whether a poem comes out being an ekphrastic poem, that is an almost direct response to a painting or not, that can be something that triggers a poem. If you're sort of what do you write about? Start looking at a book or a website, National Gallery website or something. It's almost inevitable that you're going to start either dramatizing or responding in some way to those visual images. And I would often use that as a kickstart. And I have a fellow poet at the moment, a friend of mine back in Canada called Kathleen, lovely poet. I don't think she'd mind me saying, but at the moment is currently writing a whole book of poems after one individual painter.
Mm.
They're exquisite pieces, and it's just like she's living inside this painter's sensibility at the moment. So that can be really productive. Myself, I've written a few after Frida Kahlo, quite a few after certain films. So
Yeah.
those sorts of sources can be very fruitful. I think if we're asking about how do you get started writing.
I mean, Kieran Carson, being example of that too. The paintings,
Yeah.
his final collection when he was terminally ill with cancer, he wrote an amazing collection called Still Life, and each of the poems starts with a painting or that he has hanging in his house that he loves. But really, he's writing about the poem, but he's writing about himself, and that they kind of become a jumping off point for him to write about Glandore Avenue in North Belfast and detritus and the colors of the daffodils that have been knocked over by vandal, and it's yeah, so I think, yeah, sometimes just having those restrictions,
Mhm.
like restrictions, but when you sort of say I'm going to write about this painting, it can actually unlock you in a way that just writing about, if you say write about anything,
Mm.
you can't really come up with anything. But if I were to tell you to write a poem about this orange, then that would be easier almost.
Yeah, that's that, and Kieran's book is absolutely wonderful. I recommend it to anybody as a way of how you move from the painting into just about anything
Yeah.
else. It's wonderful. The other thing, I guess, about having restrictions, and I said a little bit before about form and experimenting with form and being a bit more radical with form. But if you impose a form on yourself, like, okay, I'm going to write 3 sonnets, but be innovative within that form, or I'm going to write, I don't know, a pantoum or something, which is really difficult. Those kind of restrictions. I mean, again, to refer to my own practice, I did a sequence of 3-line poems, ended up with 100 and some of them, which became a long poem, but I called a ballad. But having imposed that restriction of 3 lines per individual segment, um, was really they just kept happening and happening because they were so short, and yet I knew, okay, I can only have 3 lines, a title and 2 lines. They weren't haikus, maybe related to that. That can be quite good too as a way of getting yourself writing. And once you start, you're locked into that form,
Mm-hmm.
and playing with that form, experimenting with it, um, is a bit like writing after painting, that you've got a challenge to meet there.
Yeah, I think so. I think like sometimes even just writing a title that's interesting can be a challenge. I had I can't even blame saying this. I've always had this kind of idea that if it was suddenly the end of the world and you had to choose people for your doomstead, which is like your home farm, and you had to choose, okay, who am I going to have? Who's going to be good with like weaponry, or who's going to be good? This is the type of stuff I think about. And I wrote a poem called Instructions for My Doomstead, and it really just came from like what, and it was just me instructing myself what would happen in the event of the end of the world. And it just sort of forced me into this place of like actually listing solid things and looking at particulars, I mean, I haven't finished that poem because keeps sort of morphing into something else. But but yeah, it was just a way to kind of, I think, yeah, to force me to sort of pay attention in a slightly different way from the outset. The title told me how to think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Has that evolved into a long poem, or is it a fairly concise
it
piece?
actually is quite concise.
Yeah.
I kind of went through a bit of a period after. For a while there, I was thinking, I'm not sure I'm ever going to write a poem ever again. I went through this phase of like struggling to kind of think about form, and I found it hard to unlock that for myself. I was thinking too much about it, I think, and it was becoming distracting. Sometimes writing in line with breaking the lines, I think, can interrupt my narrative flow, and I end up writing in a kind of a bitty way that doesn't quite join up. And this is what I was finding. I was in a bit of a moment of that. And so I took that pressure off myself and I started to write sort of prose poems. But I made this deal with myself that I would break the line every third line. I would have a line break, but the rest of it's prose poem. And I've actually been writing like that now for like the past year or so, and I've written some poems that are all in the same form. But I don't know, I can't explain it, but for some reason it unlocks something where I can write, because I do think prose and poetry seem to come well, to me, they seem to come from different parts of my brain. And there's something about the rules of a poem sometimes are similar to the rules of a story, that they sort of need a beginning and an end. And um, even though it's different obviously than a story, but I think it enabled me to sort of think more linear, to think more of a straight line, and then sort of but then have the tools of poetry come into where there's sound and there's image and
Yeah.
but sometimes, yeah, it's just finding that form for yourself, whatever that is,
Hmm.
and that can change, also. But
Yeah, I think we're seeing more and more of that kind of, as I mentioned earlier, experimentation with hybrid forms where you're saying, you're
yeah,
putting
yeah,
poetry together with prose that isn't quite, it isn't prose fiction,
yeah,
but is poetic in the way it uses language and form and structure and all of that. But that can be really interesting in terms of from a reader's point of view, to have that difference and hybridity going on within
yeah.
sequence or a collection. So
It's something I'm thinking about a lot at the minute because I'm putting together a master's module, that's sort of looking at hybrid forms, that's sort of looking at texts that aren't easy to categorize, maybe, that seem to do both, seem to point to story, but also, yeah, equally I think writers like Anne Carson, poets like that, whose processes are sort of interesting, where they write something as a story maybe, and then they make it into a poem, and then they put it back into a story. And I mean, it's quite interesting to me, that how the different parts of your brain might sort of marry up.
yes, and also there's been a movement towards what's called docu-poetry. It's not even a movement towards
Right.
it's been happening for quite a while. But you
Yeah.
mentioned Claudia Rankine, where visual images, photographs, even videos are kind of embedded into the poetry, as well as a lot of footnotes. And Anne Carson would do that.
Yeah.
Uh, Factual information as marginalia,
Yeah. Yeah.
extracts from all sorts of sources. I mean, so poetry, the point being that poetry is wildly, I would say, hybridized now if it wants to be. And then you've got sort
Yeah.
of much more conventional types of poetry happening too.
Well, I know, because in a sense, like there's always been this conversation, even between poets. Like I think of Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lyle, who were good friends, and Elizabeth Bishop wrote a long story called In the Village, and it was she had this conversation with her editor, Catherine White at the New Yorker, about what it was. Is this a prose poem? Is this their story? I don't know. And initially she put it inside a collection of poems, but in a later sort of publication of that, she took it out. And similarly with Robert Lyle, he wrote a book of poems called Life Studies, but there was
Yeah.
a long poem in the middle, which was written in prose because a psychiatrist told him, write about your childhood, but don't write it in a poem, write it in prose. And so it was interesting to think about, well, why? Why is that? Why do we write things in certain ways? I think I'm getting off point here, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Back to the there's a
Back to
question.
the question, sorry.
Uh,
Catherine, you've mentioned Milena will sift through the entries before they get to you. Is there something she will be looking for that you might not, or vice versa? I mean, maybe so. Yeah, I suppose she'll have her own sense of what. But I mean, I think I
Okay.
mean, Milena, she did the masters at Queen's in poetry, and then her PhD there as well. And then she had her first collection out recently, which was very, very good. And so I think, I mean, there's the same sort of attention that we're bringing. There'll be attention to form and attention to, a cohesive sense of voice, and I think all of those things. But yeah, Milena may certainly have her preferences for sure. Yeah,
Yeah, she is a skillful editor. I've worked with
she
her
is.
now. She's on the board at Maca Press as well, and she's edited at least one book with me. So we've chosen her because we do trust her
Mhm.
critical acumen.
Yeah.
Having said that, I mean, I've no qualms whatsoever about her ability to do that. And you will find that is what is done in most competitions, is that, 300 and some entries are read by a first reader, and
Mhm.
then a smaller number are read by the two appointed judges. Um, but having said that, every reader or judge brings their own subjectivities, the same as any editor and a publisher will bring their subjectivities. Why does one press accept your manuscript and another one doesn't?
Mhm.
There is a certain amount of subjectivity in terms of preference for subject matter or form or whatever.
And
But
even between ourselves, we have differences of opinion when it comes to the short list, and it's we end up that we usually spend a lot of hours talking it through. Yeah, it's just one of those inevitabilities, isn't it?
yeah, I think the 2 years past that we've worked together, Don, we've each chosen
Yeah,
more or less the same
yeah,
number for the short list, but
yeah,
not very same one for
yeah,
second, third position. But how do we arrive at that then? Through a lot of discussion and sort of arguing for the kind of things we've been talking about. Well, this one does this better and this one does that better. And then ultimately you have to say, okay, collectively,
yeah,
these six are the ones that are the most achieved in all the quadrants
yes,
that we're
yes,
trying to put checks in the boxes for.
exactly.
It is a pretty fair process, but there's always subjectivity. That's what you have to, I think, put your hands up and say at the end of the day.
I think so, and I think sometimes, I think the long list almost suggests itself in many ways too. I think there's always a sort of a sense of like, well, these are the ones that are the most cohesive across the board. And I think it's when it gets to the short list, then I think it's trickier because you've got all these equally strong entries almost, and so you're really just trying to look then for the minutiae. That's where that comes in more, I think.
Kate has a comment here, says, this has been so informative and helpful. Thank you. You're very welcome. Is it okay to give the title of the overall collection as well as the title of each individual poem? Um,
Yeah, I don't see why
yeah,
not. Yeah.
most people don't because they maybe aren't thinking of this as a book per se. But if you feel that it is a sequence or that the poems are all very closely connected, I think it's fair enough to give it an overall title. That's fine. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mhm. How do we
Any
do?
more questions? Nobody has their screens on. I can't see anybody's faces,
Yeah,
except for you, David Atkinson.
we can see you. Yes. And the
Glad
lovely
to,
drawing behind you. I think that's a Banksy, is it?
yeah,
Yes, Maddie. Um,
glad to see faces popping up.
we have a few more. We're 10 past 11. We're running through to 11:30. Is that right? I think
I think
so.
that is right.
So, what else do we want to go in on? What advice strategies for when you're stuck on a poem? Um, well, I don't know. I think that overlaps a little bit. Just,
Yeah, probably does. Yeah,
yeah, work on something different for a while or leave it for a while and come back to it. That kind of thing. Never abandon it. But sometimes you do have to just give up on a poem. There are some that
yeah,
just will never work, and
I
so they
know.
do. But
Yeah.
um, when is a poem finished? I think we've covered that. What does our day-to-day practice as poets look like? Again, that's probably different for everybody, but for myself, it would be sometimes you're working very intensely day after day. Other days, it's more about the kind of paying attention that you mentioned, Don, where you're just sort of living your days and making notes
Yeah.
um, towards something. Would you say anything different there?
Um, I think working at Queen's as well, I think it becomes more important that I try to carve out time for myself where I'm just, and I think it's true as a mom for anybody with responsibilities in life as well. It can be really, really hard just to make time. And there's that feeling that, well, a poem will just come to me and then I'll write it down. But I think that the sort of more mundane reality is that you do have to just go and sit at your desk, and I try to do that. For me, what I try to do is get up in the morning. And I have just moved house recently, so I was not doing this at all. But getting up in the morning and leaving my work emails for a couple of hours, and just sitting down and trying to do some writing. First thing in the morning. I'd like to get up and have a coffee and sit in my living room and look out the window. There's a holly tree with a pigeon in it that we've called Ian, and I literally just sit and sort of think for half an hour. Sometimes that's all I do. But other times, I'll go from there into my office and just sit here at the desk and just even if I write 10 words, I think it just keeps it alive in your brain. Um,
Yeah, early morning is often a good time, I think, because
yeah,
your brain isn't cluttered with all the duties, responsibilities, the interference from phone calls, etc., emails.
yeah,
Uh, even if it's later in the day, like just turning off the email and turning off the messages for even if it's an hour a day that you allocate, if you can get into, I think, some sort of discipline pattern whenever that time is.
yeah.
Um, it's also though to do with when those receptors are most open, and I think that does tend to be in the morning or maybe late at night when everything else is shut down. You might get that hour or so that is just purely for
Mhm.
listening and having the channels open. Um,
Yeah,
or even during the night, again, dreams can be a really interesting source for things. Even, you don't want to maybe just recount a dream in a poem, but uh, symbols, images that come to you in dreams. So having that notebook by the bed, and if you're awake in the night or something, sometimes you get a few lines, then the next day you're like, did I write that? But they do become a really provocative source of something. I've had a few that way.
because
So
because I think talking about that early morning thing, that sounds very perfect. But I think like in reality, that doesn't happen as often as I'd like. And the school run, for instance, I'd end up writing those 2 hours I would spend in the PEC, sometimes just sitting having a coffee and trying to tune out the sort of sometimes just background noise can be helpful. But sometimes some of my best poems I've written at 2 in the morning on my phone,
mhm, mhm.
you know.
I think it is more erratic maybe for poets. I think, you read somebody like Haruki Murakami who talks about the extraordinary discipline of his day-to-day writing life.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I have a friend right now who writes novels, and he says, I think of them as innings in a cricket game, and I have to do so many words or so many hours or minutes or whatever. It's not like that for most poets that I know. It's much more sporadic, and
Yeah.
these things come in out of left field as they come in. And it's almost like being able to respond to that and say, right now I'm going to stop and do this.
Yeah.
Because if I don't, it will be gone. Um,
Yes.
so it is a different beast in some ways than the prose fiction writer or the critical essay writer.
That's a really
So
good point, isn't it? If I don't, it'll be gone. You do have to just stop and write it down. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's the day to day or the night to night or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to Glenn Patterson recently, and he lives down at the bottom of my street, and he was talking about his practice, and he's very disciplined. I think he would leave his phone and any electronics and the internet off and just go into his office and write for, whether that's for just 30 minutes straight or whatever it is, but that happens every day. And I think that I think when you do that, there's other sort of habits that you need to do too. I think he does like 50 push-ups a day or something as well. Like there's a kind of a series of musts. And I think maybe you're right. Maybe prose people do that more. Maybe it just depends on the project. I'm working on a book at the minute that's a little more like a lyric essay. And so I find the daily habit helpful in a way that with individual poems, it's different. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could do that with editing. Maybe if you're at the stage where you're
Yeah.
editing a collection,
Yeah.
you can set a certain time. Okay, this is what I'm going to be doing, but without reducing it to inspiration, it just doesn't happen that way.
Yeah.
I'd be a practitioner of yoga as well as poetry. And oftentimes, you're doing those exercises and asanas, and something will come to you then. And so my pen and paper are often on the floor beside, which seems like, mixing and matching, but it's just wherever
Yeah.
and whenever it works for you. Train, bus,
Yeah.
walking. Yeah. Yeah. Um,
David, you're asking, does sending 5 poems give a better chance than three, or would 3 brilliant poems be better? Um, it's hard to say. I mean, if it was 5 brilliant poems versus 3 brilliant poems, I don't think that you would think, well, there's five, so that's better. I don't think so. I don't know that would really make a difference. Maybe it's just more of an opportunity to show range, like you said, Kathleen, but I don't think that the number really is the important thing for
no,
me anyway.
it's quality over quantity, I might say.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
for sure.
But I guess with the more poems you submit, the argument for that might be that if you can sustain that quality across five,
Mm, mm,
that might show us something
yeah,
more about your ability than if you sustain that across three. But that is
yeah,
not an absolute fact, like it really does depend on the achievement of the poems, each in themselves, is consistent, I think, across the
yeah.
work.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
that's a good
I
question.
definitely had situations before where someone's written an absolutely stonkingly brilliant poem, and you're just like blown away by it, but maybe the other ones are just more draft like, maybe they haven't been as polished, and it presents you with a difficult decision then between maybe someone else who's written five, three, four, five, very strong ones, so it's just a lot of conversation, isn't it? It's a lot of
Yeah, yeah, we do have to
yeah,
make difficult decisions, and you can.
yeah,
I don't think we've ever, or in this competition or others that I've been involved with, decided all in one day. Like we usually talk a bit and then go away and think about it, or email each other and go, "Where is that really right? Maybe we should rethink this. Let's have another talk about it."
yeah,
So it is always about weighing that up, and
yeah,
if you think you have five really strong poems, definitely submit them.
yeah,
But if you have three strong ones and two not so strong, I'd go for the three strong ones.
yeah,
That,
I
that
think so.
would be my advice, I think.
Yeah.
Um, just the last thing here, maybe about what general tips we have. Again, very practical things I have noted here. This is generally speaking, rather than just for this competition, but to keep some sort of record of your submissions.
Hmm.
I think sometimes people will submit helter-skelter and then you forget where did I send that one? Where does and there will be competitions that say it must all be unpublished work or no simultaneous submissions. So just as part of your practice, I think it's always good to keep a record, whether it's a spreadsheet or a Word document or whatever, where you can refer back to, well, where did I send that one and when? Um,
Yeah.
that's just it's part of the business, I
Mhm.
think, of being a poet. Um, and on top of that, not to hassle editors. Like it can be a long time sometimes before you hear back from a journal.
Yeah.
With competitions, they'll usually say to you, as we've done, winners will be announced or shortlists will be announced. But if you're submitting more generally to journals and later on to publishers with a full manuscript, once it's out of the outbox, forget about it until you hear back.
I love the way you say out.
Out, out.
Ooh, the sort of Canadian
Uh,
still there. Yeah.
well, it's probably a bit mixed with an Ulster out by now, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the only tip that kind of comes into my mind is something that's been more like a practical thing recently has been drafts. I think sometimes I've had this kind of all-in mentality where I have a single poem draft and I will edit that one poem draft like it's a single block of stone, and and that's it. And if it doesn't work out, the whole thing's gone. But surprisingly recently, I've started cutting and pasting the same poem underneath and making my changes to the one underneath, and sort of keeping those earlier ones, because sometimes the earlier one ends up being the best one. And yeah, it's just things like that, I think, is keeping your drafts.
for sure.
somebody who kind of gets, I sort of have a lot of, OCD traits where I like everything to be quite tidy. And so for me to have draft 2 final version .5 is so, I hate the thought of that. So, but I sort of pushing against that impulse to tidy and just having all the messy drafts is really helpful.
Yeah, that's where like computers and software and such are really handy because you can just create a file where you have a new version, a new version, a new version. They'll be dated.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do, but always keep them. Yeah, I had a PhD researcher, a writer that was just who said, I don't keep anything. And I was like, what? You don't keep any? It's just to keep everything clean, only the most up to date. But just as you say, you might want to, for whatever reason, go back through those versions. You might revert to the original.
Mm.
You might want to trace your own evolution of a piece for whatever purposes at some point. So I think
Yeah.
it's always good practice, as you say, to keep
Yeah.
all the drafts. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And just, I think, Catherine, you were asking, I think I missed this the first time, if you've entered before, should you send something new, or send the same batch again? Um, I think there's absolutely no rules against sending exactly the same thing again, but I think I would just think to myself, well, if it didn't sort of, if it wasn't shortlisted, maybe there's some reasons for that, and maybe there's some sort of drafting that needs to be done, or maybe there's something that needs to be drawn out more clearly within the poem, and maybe you can get some feedback on that, but there's no rules against it, but I think I would just maybe think to myself, right, okay, maybe you wonder. And but I mean, there may be no reason for it. It could be just because it was a really strong field, So it's kind of just up to yourself about that. But
Yeah, I think too, if it's
yeah,
same competition but different, that it's different judges from one year to the next. That might be an argument for submitting something that you thought was pretty good but didn't
yeah,
make it. Again, it comes back to that subjectivity thing that
I know.
maybe that pair or triumvirate of judges didn't work for them so much, but it might for somebody else. You could chance your arm that way, but
Mm-hmm.
I think not being longlisted or shortlisted is sometimes a signal that that poem does need a bit of work. So if
Mm-hmm.
you've reworked it, sure, try it again.
Yeah, 100%.
Mhm. Okay. Anything else people would like to ask? I suppose we should begin to wind up. We're nearly at our
Aye,
minutes. No,
nothing.
we've had some great questions. Very, very
Yeah,
useful questions have come up today. So thank you for all those. Yeah.
yeah, it'd been great. Um,
And just to say, there is an in-person workshop, which I'll be taking this year. Dawn took it last year. We're going turnabout on I think it's the 7th. It's 2 weeks from today, Saturday morning, 10 till 12 in the Crescent Arts, which you're very welcome to come along to. It won't be exactly like this one. I'll be doing something slightly different. It's not just advice, a certain amount of advice maybe about the competition, but it's maybe just a little different than this one in terms of looking at particular poems and strengths and weaknesses of them. So bear that in mind if you're wanting a bit more before your submission. The
that that
last,
that would
sorry,
be brilliant.
yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thank you, Dawn. I always learn things from you when we do these
Oh, same
conversations.
here. Same here. I always go away feeling like sort of refreshed and reaffirmed in some kind of way.
Yeah, we're
Um,
going to try that.
Thanks
Okay.
so much,
Well, good
Kathleen.
luck, everybody, with your submissions. And we look forward to reading them. April, is it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Best of luck. Good luck, everyone. Yeah. Can't wait to read them. Really, really excited about it.
It's a fun thing to do. We do enjoy it. We really do enjoy it. So
Yeah.
forward to it.
Yeah. Just be
Okay.
brave and do it. Do the poems. Do the poems. That's the advice. That's the strap line.
Yeah. Keep reading, keep writing, keep listening,
All
paying
right.
attention, all those things. Okay, thank you. We'll go on now. Bye.
All the best. Bye bye.